This video concerns Paper 2, US Constitution, with a comparison to the United Kingdom and the two key principles of the US Constitution, the separation of powers and checks and balances. Before we look into the United States in detail, because Paper 2 is a comparative paper, it's probably worth taking a moment now to recap those two principles and see whether they apply to the United Kingdom. So first of all, we do not have a separation of powers, we have a fusion of powers, and most famously, that is because the Prime Minister and the remainder of the executive cabinet sit in Parliament, which, when the Prime Minister's ruling party has a large majority in Parliament, it can lead to what critics refer to as an elective dictatorship. And that is when the ruling party has such a significant majority in the House of Commons that legislation isn't really scrutinised to great effect, and the success of legislation turning into law is very high. In terms of checks and balances, the presence of the executive in Parliament provides the United Kingdom with one of its most important checks on the power of the executive. First of all, we've got the role of the official opposition and the scrutiny of the executive that comes from within that. But then also we've got scrutiny from within Parliament itself, and in Paper 1 you will have looked in good detail at the role of select committees. We also have the role of the courts, and the most important court being the UK Supreme Court, which upholds the rule of law, makes sure that the executive does not act ultra vires, and is able to check the power of the executive. Then we have the role of impartial officials. First of all, we've got the civil service, which ensures that the day-to-day workings of government continue regardless of the executive. So those senior civil service roles are intended to be permanent regardless of what's going on in electoral politics and who's in and out of power. But then we've also got other regulators such as the Boundary Commission. So in the United States, you might know of a process called gerrymandering, which is where where state legislatures are able to decide the boundaries for upcoming elections. And quite often, gerrymandering is the process where these politicians decide upon political boundaries that suit their needs best. That's avoided in the United Kingdom because the Boundary Commission is an independent body that seeks to fairly represent the citizens of the United Kingdom from an apolitical standpoint. And then finally, another check and balance on the executive is the media and civil society. And quite often the scrutiny of the government's work comes from our major media outlets, and then of course the role of society in terms of key protests and demonstrations. We can judge the effectiveness of that. You could think possibly of the Iraq War demonstrations in London prior to the UK's involvement in a full invasion of Iraq, which was and still is today the largest single protest in this nation's history, which didn't turn the tide of history, and Tony Blair's new Labour government's decision to involve itself in the conflict continued regardless of that protest. But we can see how society and the media can play a role in checking the actions and the power of the executive. Some have argued actually that the phrase separation of powers should be replaced with shared powers. Now, the founding fathers, when they set out to write the Constitution, looked to Britain as an example not to be followed. Remember that the American Revolution and the creation of this nation was all based upon freeing itself from the tyranny of an overly powerful executive. And so those founding fathers set out to divide government and the powers of government equally between the executive, embodied by the president, the legislature, Congress, and the judiciary, the Supreme Court. However, written in the Constitution are some shared powers in certain areas of policy. For example, both Congress and the President are involved in and have the power to pass legislation. The Vice President sits in the Senate as the President of the Senate and casts a vote in the cases where the vote has resulted in a tie in that House. And then, of course, there's the shared power over conflict, where the President acts as Commander-in-Chief of the armed forces, but Congress has the power to declare war. And a shared power between the executive and the judicial branch is that the President has the power of pardon, which overlaps with the role of the courts. With the exception of decisions made at state level and those regarding impeachment, the President can pardon anyone charged and found guilty of a federal crime. However, despite those limitations, certainly when compared to the United Kingdom, it is certainly fair to say that the United States enjoys a separation of powers that the United Kingdom does not. And now we come to checks and balances, which is going to be the lengthiest part of the video because it's going to go through in some detail each check and balance that each branch has on the other. Now there'll be a worksheet to complete alongside this, and so it might be wise, particularly through this slide, to pause as you go along, which will help you write up your notes. I'm going to start with Congress because in the eyes of the Founding Fathers, the legislature was the most important branch of government. That's why it's mentioned and covered first in the Constitution, ahead of President and Supreme Court. So let's look at the powers that Congress has, first of all, over the executive. And remember that the Founding Fathers were particularly concerned of an overly powerful executive. That is what they had experienced in the form of the British monarch prior to the American Revolution. So, congressional checks on the President. If the President vetoes a law passed by Congress, it can be overturned with a 2/3 majority in both houses. The Senate must confirm by a majority presidential appointments to the administration, including to the Supreme Court. Congress also has what we call the power of the purse and can turn down the President's request for funding. And that was seen most recently in 2023 when we nearly ended up in another situation where there was a federal government lockdown because Congress was refusing to ratify the President's request for funding to help Ukraine fight war after the invasion from Russia. The President also outlines a legislative agenda in the State of Union address, and Congress can simply work to deny the President's wishes in passing that legislation. And this is two high-profile cases that presidents suffered with. Barack Obama, after the Sandy Hook massacre, struggled to get gun control reforms through Congress, and Trump similarly struggled to get a healthcare reform passed through Congress when faced with a Democrat-controlled Congress in the later years of his term as president. Some more powers that Congress has. Well, first of all, if the President agrees or negotiates a treaty with a foreign power, Congress has the power to block it. Now, that quite often comes with foreign treaties. Famously, we could look as far back as the Treaty of Versailles, which Congress refused to ratify in the wake of the First World War, which signalled the beginning of a period of isolationism for the United States. Congress can also launch investigations into the actions of the President when there are concerns of wrongdoing, which we have seen in the case of President Trump. In 2019, Congress investigated the President's decision to use a Scottish airport to refuel US Air Force, which was very close to a golf course that the President personally owned. And then finally, we've got the nuclear option, which is impeachment, to remove the President from office. And remember that the House votes to impeach and then the Senate votes to convict. In the case of Donald Trump, we have a president who became the first in history to be impeached twice in the House, but on both occasions he was not convicted by the Senate. When it comes to congressional checks on the courts, it's a much shorter list. Now, first of all, we could look at how congressional amendments have been used to overturn Supreme Court decisions. So, for example, The 13th Amendment, which was designed to end once and for all the issue of slavery in the United States, came after some high-profile Supreme Court decisions, including the Dred Scott decision of 1859, which was where the court ruled in a 7-2 majority that African Americans couldn't sue for their rights in the Supreme Court because no black American was a US citizen. When the 13th Amendment is passed in the years following the American Civil War, we get the end of slavery. The 14th Amendment gives all individuals equal protection under the law. So Congress's amendments can overturn and overrule previous Supreme Court decisions. And also, Congress can impeach federal justices and remove them from office. Now, this happened famously in 2010 when a federal judge in Louisiana by the name of Thomas Porteous was impeached and removed from office for corruption, and the vote was nearly unanimous and enjoyed support from both Democrat and Republican lawmakers. Now we'll move on to the court, and we'll first of all look at its checks on the president. And the most powerful judicial check on the president is that it can rule that the actions of the president are unconstitutional and therefore illegal. In 2010, the Supreme Court ruled in 2 cases against Donald Trump, and it was concerning his personal financial matters. In both of those decisions in 2020, the Supreme Court basically decided that the president was not immune from a state criminal subpoena, which means that the president, even when he's in office, is not above the law at state or federal level. The main check that the Supreme Court has over Congress is that it can declare acts of Congress unconstitutional, which effectively requires those laws to be repealed. In 2013, the Defence of Marriage Act was ruled unconstitutional in the US versus Windsor case, which was a major advance for the legislation of same-sex marriage in the United States. And finally, we come to the president. And remember, this was the branch of government that the Founding Fathers were most concerned about the powers of, and they were keen to limit the powers of the president sufficiently so that tyrannical rule could never come to the United States. So let's look at what the president can do in terms of checking the power of Congress. We talked before about Congress's ability to override the veto, so it's probably wise for me to start with that the president can veto an act or a resolution passed by Congress. Famously, in Donald Trump's presidency, he declared a national emergency on the southern border with Mexico. Congress passed a resolution which essentially revoked that declaration and said that the situation at the southern border was not a national emergency, but Trump was able to veto that resolution. Sometimes the very threat of a veto can prevent Congress from spending its time debating and passing legislation. Famously, Barack Obama in 2015 laid out 4 issues that he would veto, and they were the topics of stiffer sanctions on Iran, diluting or overturning the Affordable Care Act, which was otherwise known as Obamacare, loosening oversight of Wall Street, so removing regulations of the financial district in New York, and tightening up immigration controls. In 2015, those were 4 areas that Barack Obama said, if they arrive on my desk, they will be vetoed. So sometimes just the very threat of a veto can be enough to influence the actions of Congress. Now, when a president needs to get something done without the usual legislative process, the president has the power of an executive order, which bypasses the formal legislation process. And so in 2017, the famous example is the so-called Muslim ban, an executive order from Donald Trump as president, which was a travel ban on visitors from several countries, many of them with a high majority Muslim population. Now, the first version of that executive order was found to be unconstitutional, and a second version was passed. An amended version was eventually passed into law. And finally, one thing that my class have covered already is this tension between the Commander-in-Chief and Congress's decision to declare war often means that the President is able to enact military strategy before Congress has had the opportunity to declare war. So in the 21st century, we've got the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan initiated by President George W. Bush, which later had the approval of Congress. If we go back a little more historically, we can see the bombing campaigns in Laos and Cambodia, countries neighbouring Vietnam, which began without the knowledge or consent of Congress in the 1970s. And finally, the President's checks on the courts. Well, first of all, the President is able to nominate all federal justices, and that includes vacancies on the Supreme Court, which gives a President an influence over who sits on the courts. Now, the Founding Fathers and their intentions, and also theoretically, these decisions are supposedly done with the best intentions of the country in mind, and the idea being that the best justices around the nation are able to advance their careers. However, because of this process, the appointments to and the decisions of the Supreme Court have become politicised. So we've seen in recent years Republican presidents appointing so-called conservatives to the Supreme Court, and Democratic presidents appointing so-called liberal justices to the court. And the decisions of the Supreme Court change as the makeup of the court changes. So Donald Trump was able to change the makeup of the Supreme Court in his one term as president to give the conservative side of the Supreme Court a majority, which led most famously to the Dobbs decision in 2022, which overruled the 1973 decision in Roe versus Wade, which gave every American woman the federal right to an abortion. And as covered previously on this video in a previous slide, the President is able to issue pardons and commutations for people convicted of federal crimes, with the exception of those who have been impeached. Famously, President Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon for his involvement in the Watergate scandal of the 1970s. Donald Trump issued pardons for two individuals that helped his campaign to become president, Steve Bannon and Roger Stone, both of whom had been convicted of federal crimes. And one thing that Americans look to in a president's final months and weeks and days in office is people speculate as to who will be pardoned. Barack Obama pardoned 330 individuals and commuted 330 sentences on his final day as president. Donald Trump managed far fewer, but the pardons for Bannon and Stone were particularly high profile based on their involvement in Donald Trump's election, but also involved in many of his controversies whilst serving as President of the United States. Now, it's interesting to end on this one because, as I've tried to reinforce, the Founding Fathers were most keen to limit the power of the President. And here we see the Constitution granting the President a significant power. He can either pardon someone of a federal crime, which means that any punishment for a crime has been waived and essentially brushed off, but also the power of commutation, which can reduce particularly prison sentences, for example. It can reduce the punishment handed out to an individual. And it's interesting to think that when this Constitution was written, it was done in the name of limiting the power of the President, but here is this quite significant power. And the reason for it is short-term thinking. The Founding Fathers were particularly keen that rebels in the early days of the nation, this new nation and the liberal experiment that we call the United States, that early rebels might be pardoned in the interests of reconciliation and bringing and keeping the nation together. And what it's resulted in a modern sense, is quite often we see high-profile cases of presidents pardoning individuals in search of either personal or ideological reassurance. Now, there's another conversation that needs to be had now about the significance of the checks and balances, but I'm mindful that this video has already gone on long enough, so we're going to end it there, and we'll cover significance of checks and balances in another video.